and Justin are going to be in conversation for about 45 minutes. Then we'll have 15 minutes for your questions. We have a virtual component of this, so there's folks at home watching. If you could bring your questions to that mic, or there'll be a mic right here so that everybody here and back home can hear your question, it would be greatly appreciated. Afterwards, Mark, be happy to sign your books. The Ivy Bookshop is outside here. If you could purchase a book, it'd be well appreciated. Also, we have a copy of our internal promotional magazine, Compass, and then our May and June programs. We do a program here every 2 weeks, two a week. And there's something there for you, I promise. So looking forward to seeing you again. Tonight, I'm happy to welcome Mark Bowden to the Pratt Library to discuss his latest book, Life Sentence. In it, he reports on the 2016 FBI investigation that resulted in the arrest of gang leader Montana Barronette in Baltimore's Sandtown neighborhood. Mr. Bowden was given access to FBI case files and interviews with Barronette's family and neighbors to provide a detailed account of the gang leader's life. He will be joined in conversation this evening by Baltimore Banner investigative reporter Justin Fenton. Halfway through their conversation, Mark and Justin will also bring to the stage Joe Landsman, one of the police officers who worked on this case. Mark Bowden is the best-selling author of several books, including Black Hawk Down. He is also a journalist who formerly wrote for the Philadelphia Inquirer and currently contributes to the Atlantic magazine. Justin Fenton is an investigative reporter for the Baltimore Banner. He's the author of We Own This City, a true story of crime, cops, and corruption that was recently adapted into an HBO miniseries. Author and Washington Post contributing columnist Matt Bai called Life Sentence a masterpiece, right up there with Black Hawk Down and Guests of the Ayatollah. It's gripping, it's fast, it's deeply insightful and empathetic, and it's brilliantly and exhaustively reported. In Publishers Weekly starred review, they wrote, "A scorching true crime narrative. Bowden pulls no punches in his indictment of the ways in which the richest country in the world has allowed Black children for decades to be born into blighted urban neighborhoods and saddled them with burdens that they must struggle to surmount to lead meaningful lives. This account of young men growing up in a place where murderous violence has become a way of life will haunt readers long after they finish it." And in another starred review, Kirkus Reviews wrote that the book is a powerful, nuanced description of gang violence in America that makes a strong case for meaningful reform beyond policing. It's my great pleasure to welcome Mark Bowden and Justin Fenton to the Pratt Library.
Sorry. Looking for a microphone holder. Okay, thank you everyone for coming out. This is the latest event in the Pratt Library Writers Live series. It's nice to be together in the same room. I had a book come out a couple years ago, and my Pratt Library event was on the computer. So this is nice. But we're here today to talk to Mark Bowden. As he said, he's a best-selling author. He's written about the war on terror, the NFL, poaching of endangered species, drug trafficking, the 2020 election, and much, much more. His latest book, as you know, is Life Sentence, the brief and tragic career of Baltimore's deadliest gang leader. It traces the crimes and takedown of a West Baltimore crew who called themselves Trained to Go. And over a span of a few years, they were responsible for a staggering amount of violence. This is a case I followed with interest at the time, but I didn't think it got the coverage that it deserved. And so I was thrilled when I heard through sources actually that Mark was working on this years ago. So I'm really interested to see how it turned out. And it really is a gripping read with a lot of insights into the issues that go into not just this case, but so much of the street violence that we see in this city. So please welcome Mark. So you were not born here, but you attended high school and college here, Delaney High and Loyola University, and then you worked for the News American and Baltimore Magazine before going to Philly. So I was curious if you could tell us about sort of how your start in journalism here impacted your career, whether it was negative, positive.
Well, I was lucky enough to get a job at the News American right after I graduated from college. And I had been the editor of my college newspaper, so that's what kind of greased the skids for me to get hired. And the truth is that, I was an English major in college, and I had ambitions of writing novels and plays, poetry. And newspaper work was I figured it was better than my job running the cash register at the supermarket because it was a step closer to actually writing for a living. But I fell in love with newspaper work. And at the time, this is in the early 1970s, there was this great flowering of what was then called new journalism. Writers like Tom Wolfe and Gay Talese and Joan Didion and Norman Mailer, who were doing extremely creative nonfiction writing. And so by virtue of the fact that I could get paid to work as a reporter, and I saw what could be done writing creatively, writing nonfiction, those became my motivations then to stay with it. Unfortunately, the News American was not interested in the kind of work that I wanted to do. So Stan Heisler over at Baltimore Magazine invited me over one day and said, I'd like you to do this, or I'd like you to do that. I want you to do a profile of that Ted Venetoulis. That was the first big piece that I did for Baltimore Magazine. And that gave me a chance to both sort of show off my reporting chops and also finally to really write. And so that work is the kind of work that sort of, drew me into more in-depth reporting and writing, and eventually into books. And as you know, Hollywood sometimes comes knocking.
And you told me in the green room, you're working for both at the same time. You sort of were saying, if you don't want this, I'm taking it over here.
Yeah.
That worked out for you.
Well, and I think, I was always fairly stubborn about doing what I wanted to do. And so generally, I would, when I was working for newspapers, I would do what they asked of me, and I would do it well, I think. But I would always have my own project on the side, which was just something that I was interested in, that hadn't been assigned to me by anyone. And it was always something in-depth and longer. And I would get in trouble every once in a while. I remember my city editor in Philadelphia saying, where do you disappear to every afternoon? I think he thought I was out drinking or playing basketball or something. But actually, I was working on a story, and then that story eventually ran in the Sunday magazine. And I remember that same editor came to me and said, I'm sorry if I gave you a hard time. That was a great piece of work, and the next time just tell me what you're doing. So I always did have a kind of an ability to sort of handle what I needed to handle here, but do what I wanted to do over here.
And you are quite prolific. The work that you did at the Inquirer, magazine work, now books. It's seemingly every 2 years you've got a book coming out. It's a staggering array of topics, each requiring you.
Let me just interrupt, Joseph. Yeah. I may seem very prolific. What I actually am is old. So, when you write steadily over 50 years, you accumulated a tremendous body of work.
No, there's no, this is not a writer who's taking years and years. We're not, we get a steady stream of work to read. And I'm interested because that requires you to become an expert on these topics before you move on to the next. How do you size up whether a topic is going to be interesting to you and whether there's going to be enough there to turn into a book or a magazine piece?
Well, I think you get better at it. Early on, before I was writing books regularly, very often I would start working on a story and I would feel like this is really a book. I wish I could write a book about this, and I didn't have the opportunity to do that. And actually my first couple of books were examples of me grabbing onto material and turning them into books that, looking back on it with the experience that I have now, maybe I wouldn't have done that. But now I have a little bit more flexibility. I don't really need to write books anymore if I don't want to. So really the answer to your question is, if something interests me enough that I want to keep working on it. And you know the feeling, Justin, when you're working on something and I don't have enough. I need to find somebody to tell me more about this, or I need to find that. And when you're lucky enough to be able to work for years on a project, you eventually touch those bases. So sometimes it's just, I see if I have the time, I could really dig in and do something book length. And sometimes it's things start falling in your lap that you didn't ever imagine that you would gain access to. And at that point, you say to yourself, well, gosh, this is not just a magazine piece. This is a book.
Are there themes to the topics that you select, whether it's conscious or subconscious?
Probably subconscious. I remember one time, one of my friends at the Philadelphia Inquirer, a woman who I'd worked with for a number of years, said, Mark, all you ever write about are men. And in fact, when I thought about it, she was right. And the first few books that I wrote, the first book was about a fraternity at the University of Pennsylvania, where the guy in the fraternity, Larry Lavin, was selling drugs, and they became this big drug ring. So that's literally a fraternity. And so the next book I wrote was about a football team, which again is a fraternity. And the next book I wrote was Black Hawk Down, which was about U.S. Army Rangers, and again, a group of guys. I never sat down and said, this is my forte, this is what I want to do. But it occurred to me, I'm one of 8 children. One of my brothers is sitting right there. And 6 of us are males. So I grew up in a fraternity, a literal fraternity. I grew up in bedrooms where we slept 3 triple bunk beds, And so that was my life. And so I never consciously set out to explore that as a theme, but it happened, and I eventually, I think, have branched out from that a little bit. But I think the answer to your question is really curiosity. I pursue a story because I'm curious about it. And I don't spend a lot of time analyzing why I find that interesting.
Okay. Do you ever, this is my last question about process, because I just, I want to hear these things from the master of this stuff. How often do you get into something and walk away?
More often now than I did years ago.
Okay.
When I was younger and had a lot more energy and was more ambitious, I would pretty much tackle any opportunity that came my way. Now I'm choosier. Now, if I just started working on a story for the Atlantic last summer, and I spent months trying to get traction. And then eventually I just said to myself, I'm done. Yeah, I'm not doing that. If I was younger and I wanted to spend another year beating my head against the wall, which is sometimes what you have to do, I would probably keep at it, but I don't have the patience for this anymore, so I pulled the plug on it.
So this book started with an invitation from the U.S. Attorney's Office. That sounds unusual to me, but perhaps people are seeking you out for these things. But you sort of found this story within a conversation. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it is unusual for the U.S. Attorney to invite a reporter, and mostly they won't answer your questions. So I got an invitation to come in and talk, and this was when Robert Hur was the U.S. Attorney, and his first assistant, I think it was really his first assistant, Jonathan Lenzner, who really initiated this. And Jonathan, I think they were very proud of the work that they were doing to tackle the extreme levels of violence in the city. And so they wanted to talk to me about some of the methodology that they were using, it was interesting, but then I asked them, can you give me an example? And so they said, well, yeah. And they told me about TTG and Montana Barronette. And I said, well, that really interests me. So while the book does delve into, and I think it's fascinating, the investigative processes, how this gang was eventually successfully prosecuted, it's really a book about who these young men are and how and why they became what they became. These are a group of, at the time they were teenagers, who killed about 20 people over a period of 2 or 3 years. And that's just an astonishing and horrifying fact. And so it begs the question, who were these guys, and what produced them? What kind of world? And it's a bigger question, obviously, than just Baltimore and TTG. This is going on in every city in America, certainly true in Philadelphia and New York and LA. And I think this was my opportunity to try and understand this very terrible phenomenon.
Yeah, and as part of that, you really lean into this idea that the conditions in the communities that experience it most harshly, or it was foreign to you, that you grew up in the county and
Yeah.
that you felt as though, you weren't racist and that, that you cared. And yet like there's this chasm between, the white and black communities of the city. You really leaned into talking about that. Can you talk about why you decided to?
Sure. Another reason that this project so interested me was it gave me a chance to dig deeply into the history of Baltimore and, how and why things are the way they are. As a reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer, the first time I visited South Africa in the early 1980s, apartheid was still in place. And so I was horrified to go to public beaches where there would be signs saying white race group only, or walk up to the door of a restaurant with a big sign that said white race group only. And so I just was shocked by this. But then on reflection, I thought, how different is that really than the world I grew up in Baltimore? I graduated from Delaney High School in 1969 with a baby boomer class of 600 students, 3 of whom were black. 10 miles away, high school, Edmondson Westtown High School, exactly the opposite, 99.9. And this is what, 40 years after Brown versus Board of Education? I mean, this was, and remains to some extent, a very starkly segregated city. And so my experience, as close as I was geographically to the kids growing up in Sandtown, might as well have been on a different planet.
Yeah, and I think that coverage of crime in East and West Baltimore, we very rarely hear from the folks who are like steeped in it. We hear from victims' families, law enforcement. You had 2 key characters who really helped you, in addition to the wiretap transcripts and things like that, where we do hear people speaking in their own voices. There's 2 characters who really help you open that door. Can you talk about how you're able to get them to agree to talk to you?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. The way I was able to is because of Joe Landsman, who's sitting in the back right there, who will join us a little bit later. But Joe is a very distinguished Baltimore City Police homicide detective it comes from a family of police and detectives who became part of this task force, which took down TTG. So when I met Joe, he helped me. He introduced me to some of the people who were confidential informants, like Ronnie Johnson and Ponyhead, who were drug dealers in Sandtown. So they were willing to talk to me about their lives and about the world that they lived in. And that was just invaluable to me. The other avenue was Montana Barronette himself. One of the first things I did when I started working on this book was write letters to all of the defendants in prison, asking if they would be willing to talk to me. None of them would, but Montana wrote back a very nice letter. And he explained he would really like to talk to me, but his lawyer has advised him that he has an appeal that is really his only hope of ever getting out of prison, and he should never talk about his case. But he gave me a name and phone number for his sister, Shanika, and other members of his family, and he gave them permission to talk to me about him and about their experience, and that was invaluable. Shanika was fantastic. She's, smart, very eloquent on the subject of, her family, the conditions they grew up in, the conditions that created, the criminal life of her brothers, Montana and Terrell. So, that's how I did it.
Yeah. I'm sure with so many cases that you cover and not living here currently, how interested were you as you got deeper into this, how many connections this story has to other major stories in this area? Montana Barronette was accidentally released from prison and ended up at a Gervonta Davis boxing
Isn't
match.
that amazing?
There's gun trace task force connections. There's Danielle Taylor is a detective who was featured briefly, and she had a kind of a central role in the Freddie Gray case in some ways. I mean, it touches on, and Sandtown itself. I mean, the neighborhood of Sandtown. How interesting was that to you to just peel that onion?
It was great, and it illustrated once more how much, in some ways, a small town Baltimore remains. I mean, your story, which you wrote about in We Own This City, the Gun Trace Task Force, Wayne Jenkins, he makes a cameo appearance in Life Sentence. And interestingly, he wanted to get involved, with this investigation because he wanted to get involved in anything he could get his hands on. And the assistant U.S. attorney who met with him told the other task force members, we don't want anything to do with this guy. And which they, in retrospect, felt was fairly prescient because this was before Jenkins was arrested and prosecuted. So,
Yeah. Should we call up Joe now?
Joe, will you
Joe
join
Landsman?
us?
You can come up.
Joe's father, some of you may remember the character.
You're stealing my stuff here.
Oh, okay. I won't.
No, as he comes up here, Joe's. I don't know that police officers are necessarily like household names, but this comes pretty close. The Landsman family have been policing the city and county for many, many years. His father was depicted in David Simon's book Homicide, A Year on the Killing Streets. A fan favorite character in The Wire was named after Jay Landsman, and then he got to play a different character in The Wire. And so you were a police officer for how many years?
22.
22. Okay. And you had a stellar reputation with the police department. We've actually never met. So this.
Yeah, no, we met. You had
We
the
met.
Kenneth Johnson case.
Oh, that's right.
Joe remembers everything. It's one of the reasons why he was such a good cop.
We didn't really talk, I guess is what I'm saying. But you've actually left the
Yeah, I
police
retired
department.
last February.
I feel like the department is experiencing a major brain drain right now of talented, experienced investigators. Why? Can I ask why the time was right to leave?
Well, actually, I think it's been going on for some time because in 2007, like I was telling Mark, like the homicide unit were like mostly veterans with like 30 years and more. And then like over time, people kept leaving. And now you go there and it's like, I think the average is probably 15 to 25 years. So
I think Joe started when he was about 12.
yeah.
And you've even been involved with many, many, many cases. How does this case fit into the different things you've investigated?
I guess it doesn't really fit in. I guess it was unique because how many victims were involved and then how many, like as an organization, just, fits the criteria of like the federal murder case. So you don't usually, maybe one or two a year come across the floor. So, it wasn't as every other case that's coming across. I think I was the primary on 17 murders, but out of those 17, this would have been, I wasn't working cases like this as a homicide investigator.
Would you have been able to do a case like this just as in the Baltimore force?
Yeah, but at the time, so there's Gary Smith in the back. I teamed up with him. And when I had the 2010, there was a girl working on the block, but Gary took the lead as the federal murder case to, get the group involved since it's the multi-co-defendants. And as a homicide investigator, I couldn't take the lead to do a federal case like this. You had to have the federal support from FBI, ATF, or DEA, whatever.
Yeah. We often hear about the alphabet boys, the federal agencies sort of saving the day, but it's
Yeah.
really the Baltimore police officers who make up these task forces. You're a task force officer working with the FBI, but you're a Baltimore police officer.
Yeah, no, I guess that's how it is. It does work like that. So if you read the book, you see Danielle Taylor and all the homicide guys, they get brought in and they take those portions of evidence and then bring it in to create that organization crime that's going to be charged federally. So,
And the way I describe it in the book is that the federal agencies have all these incredible tools
yeah.
and talent, but they're looking at neighborhoods like through a telescope.
Yeah.
Baltimore City Police, like Joe, have been in these neighborhoods for years. They know the people on the streets. They know the history of the characters who they've arrested and people who have helped them in the past. So in order for something like this investigation to take place, they absolutely need somebody like Joe or Dan DiLorenzo
Yeah.
or Mark Neptune who really know Baltimore.
Yeah, and you talk about his knack for being able to speak to people, get people to talk to you. Obviously, police community relations we know there are many problems there, but how do you get people to trust you and help you to solve these crimes that are affecting their families, their communities?
Well, over time, just working those areas and, well, in homicide, you're going to meet hundreds of people. And then I think it's just you work in a drug unit or as a patrol officer, you never learn like the background of the people you're interviewed, like you do working in a homicide unit. So it's definitely an advantage as coming from that unit as an investigator, where you get a witness in there and they have more trust in you speaking to you. So you'll start to gather information about their background, and then they start to trust in you, and then working with them. And then it's kind of like you have this network. You're always going to go back to them, and then they'll refer you to other people, and then you build off of that.
But you kind of trade, don't you? I
Yeah.
mean, you know, when somebody's arrested, facing charges, there's sometimes things you can do to help
Yeah.
them, and they can help you by
Right.
explaining to you what's actually happening that
Yeah.
you otherwise wouldn't know.
Yeah, and you gain their trust that way, and then they're gonna, well, he did this for me, so then they owe you later, and it's like you should continue working on it.
One of the characters that I write about, who Joe introduced me to, Ronnie Johnson, told me that he remembered Joe because he treated him to a sub sandwich down near the Inner Harbor, somewhere over
Yeah, we
around
went.
Fells Point.
Yeah, Ronnie came in. He talked about a bunch of murders, and then we went, and he was in his red suit, so we left the area, and went and ate and looked at the water while he ate his sandwich. So
And he remembered that. I mean, he'd been locked up for a long time, and that was a small act of kindness.
right.
And years later, when he was in a fix, he thought, well, who can I call? And he remembered the cop who did him a
Yeah.
solid. You
He
know?
relayed that message through the central. They called me, and then we met up again.
Good story.
Mark writes towards the end of the book that the train to go prosecution, this is a quote, did nothing to change Baltimore's dreadful status quo. How do you feel about the fact that there are so much effort put into solving this problem, and it seems like it just keeps going?
So I think that there's not enough federal agencies to keep these cases going, so it's kind of tough. But we do, each time we do a case like this, look at what effect it had. Did the violence go down? Like, did you stop it in the area? And like, I think it does, but I don't know whether you can maintain that. I mean, what do you do to keep it so, that it doesn't come back over time? It probably will, but I think when you look at the takedown, then you go over a period of time, there was this decrease in violent crime, but then it starts to come back. So.
Yeah. One of the things I think you talk about is that there's so many things that need to be done to address poverty and the conditions of the neighborhoods, but this has to happen too.
Yeah, I think, there's an element of satisfaction on a personal level. Joe and the other detectives get to know the families of victims. They get to know people whose lives have been destroyed or permanently changed because of some act of violence. And so there is a degree of satisfaction in just achieving justice, for those people. But the larger problems that afflict Baltimore, Philadelphia, every other major city in the country are kind of beyond the reach of even the most sophisticated investigative groups. I argue in this book that if we are as a society going to change what's going on, it's going to take a massive effort, something on the order of the social engineering that went on for 100 years to create, neighborhoods like Sandtown. But part of that effort has to be good law enforcement, because one of the factors that makes people living in neighborhoods that are beset with violence reluctant to cooperate with the police is the police aren't catching them.
Right.
And when some murderer, somebody murdered somebody who's a neighbor of yours or a relative, is still out there with a gun. Are you going to cooperate with the police?
No.
If that makes you a target for that person, you might cooperate with them if you had a lot of faith that they would be arrested soon and that they would be brought to justice. But when that doesn't happen, then people are afraid to help, are afraid to cooperate. And then what happens is you get revenge killings. People start taking guns in their own hands and avenging the deaths of their friends and their relatives, which feeds,
Just a nonstop cycle.
yes, it feeds the violence.
Yeah, there's certainly many cases that get closed, many federal takedowns, but there's so many that still aren't solved that it seems like it feeds this perception that nothing's going to happen, even though many people will get caught and go away to prison for the rest of their lives, but they think it's not going to happen. You talked about a certain inevitability to what Montana Barronette became. You write, deadly violence was part of the game. It was accepted. The gang was inured to it, an unalterable fact of life in Sandtown since well before they were born. Tana killed serially, but he was not a serial killer in the common sense of the term. While morally null, Tana was not mentally ill. He and the rest of his crew were normal teenagers in an aberrant environment, an extreme product of a violent oppositional subculture, not just trained to go, but bred to go or kill. I found the conclusions of the book accurate, and I felt very depressed reading it.
Well, let me try to take some of that depression away.
Okay.
As bad as the conditions are in neighborhood like Sandtown, most of the kids who grow up in that neighborhood do well. They overcome the difficulties and the obstacles. They finish high school, they get jobs, they become productive citizens. It's the small number. Kurt Schmoke told me that if you go into a average Baltimore high school, there's probably one kid in every homeroom class by high school who has been lost to the streets. You're never going to get them back. But that's not that many, except in a big high school, that may be 40 kids or 50 kids. And if they're out there, acting out violently, killing one another, that colors the experience in that neighborhood for everybody. It colors those, it defines those neighborhoods in our minds, when in fact, the reality of those neighborhoods are, you have so many people who are doing well, who are resisting what is a very strong pull, to head out to the corner and make $100 a night, as opposed to get a job at McDonald's and make, I don't know, whatever minimum wage is these days. So it's not a hopeless story. People are decent and people are capable of overcoming these problems. But I think they need help. At the very least, they need good schools. We fund schools in this country with property taxes, which means that the absolute worst, most needy neighborhoods in the country have the least amount of money to spend on education, have the worst schools. The most affluent, least needy neighborhoods in the country have the most money, have the best teachers, and the best schools. And so why does it exist that way? Well, one of the reasons it exists is racism. And it's been true, not just in Baltimore, but in cities all over the country for centuries.
Have you seen a change on the streets in terms of, again, we know that the violence it's gone up and down, but it's pretty much been at a high level for a very long time. What changes, if any, did you see over the years, though, within that environment?
Through, I guess, the development of the different areas, like Sandtown Winchester is not the same Sandtown Winchester when I started in the early 2000s. I guess the development, but some of the kids you'll see were the same, but I don't think it was the same amount of people. Like if you went there at Calhoun and Mosier, it was mainly vacant houses, but now that's like the vacant houses are gone and now there's new build houses. So it's definitely changing. There's money being put into it, but like Mark says, that you got to change like the education and whatever resources to put in and reach out to the actual people who are living in the community. Because
have you seen any changes, though, in the sense of the way crime is committed or the attitudes of the people that you investigate?
Yes, it definitely, like Mark's saying, where you have these patterns of violence occurring, it's not like it's this widespread thing. You'll realize that it's like this small group of suspects responsible for it. And then when you start to investigate a period of 10 years, you'll realize these guys are working together. And it's not this widespread thing where all these killers are out there. It's a small group of people who are terrorizing that 1300 block of Harlem or Calhoun and Mosier.
When people hear that, they'll probably say, "Then so just get them." Why do these investigations, these sprawling investigations, take so much time?
Well, that's what all the supervisors say. Just get them.
Well, I think actually the book illustrates the level of difficulty involved.
Yeah.
It's not easy to assemble, in this case, a RICO case, to try 8 defendants at the same time and convict all of them. It took years. And to get people to cooperate as informants, to explain to the police what's going on, to know where you can find where weapons are stashed or hidden.
Mm-hmm.
You have to very meticulously document how drugs are being sold in order to build a drug case against a group like this, and they're smart. I mean, they know how to play the game. They're not making it easy.
Yeah, there was no one investigative tactic that was super successful. So it was everything, the wiretap, the witnesses, then the firearms being recovered, the video surveillance. So it was everything together was able to accomplish the investigation. So it wasn't like just go out and get them thing.
Okay. Mark, you've told stories that are sprawling and enormous, like the hunt for Osama bin Laden, and more intimate tales about individuals and their stories. What's harder for you, sorting through a sort of a mass of information, or trying to stretch a more intimate story?
Well, I think, the more complex a story is, the more difficult it is. And I think probably the most difficult project that I ever undertook was a book called Hue 1968, which was about this battle in Vietnam, the largest single battle fought in Vietnam, where literally tens of thousands of people were involved, from American soldiers, Viet Cong, North Vietnamese regulars, civilians, Army, Marines. Getting my arms around a project like that, traveling to Vietnam, hiring a translator, finding people who fought for the Viet Cong. These were challenges,
Yes.
Even just the logistics of trying to do a story like that are very difficult. I think I prefer if I can lean into a story with fewer characters, with a smaller frame. And those are easier stories to do, but very often you get caught up in more nuanced, emotional, and you get more involved and attached to the people you're writing about. I mean, in the way 1968, I met and interviewed hundreds of people before I wrote that book. I mean, in doing this, I got to know Joe really well, and the 2 or 3 guys who worked with him, and some of the people from the neighborhood, but it wasn't, anything on the scale of Hue. So, I'm proud of the big complex stories. I think I might be old enough that I won't do them anymore, but who knows?
Can you tell us what you're working on now?
You know what? I just spent the last few days in Wilmington, Delaware, in the courthouse, watching the preliminaries for the Dominion versus Fox News trial. And I had contracted with an online magazine called Airmail to write like weekly essays about the progress of that trial. And I was so relieved when they settled. Because if they hadn't settled, I was going to have to go every day for 6 solid weeks. I'm not as young as I was when I was a young reporter working for the newspaper. So I ended up writing just a wrap-up piece, which will run this weekend. And I'm awaiting an assignment from the Atlantic, which I think will involve the Nord Stream pipeline explosion.
Okay. We have sailed through my questions. I'm wondering if we should turn it over to the audience now.
If you have a question, you can line up here at that point. Time for about 20 minutes.
Yes, it's me. I haven't read your book yet, but generally, 2 authors, policemen. The notion that, I guess, the Gun Trace Task Force was a rogue unit, or the notion that the TTG was a violent and unique unit. How much of this stuff is here in Baltimore? How many bad organizations are out here running the streets of Baltimore?
Well, the current estimate of drug gangs in Baltimore is 320, 321. And, one of the big changes in the drug industry in the city is, from when I was younger, is that there used to be people like, say, Peanut King, who ran a syndicate that was, you see it in The Wire, depicted in The Wire, people running organizations that have markets in a whole half of the city or a big portion of the city. Because drugs now are so readily easy to obtain, it seems like almost every neighborhood has its own little organization set up to sell on the corners, and many of them are violent because when you get into an illicit business, obviously, if somebody steals your product or tries to chase you off a corner, you can't report it to the police. You have to defend your turf. And so this leads to violence, between warring factions in the city. And, I think that accounts for a tremendous number of the young bodies that are found on the street. And then, the other thing that's happened, and maybe Joe can talk about this, is that the role that social media has begun to play, where people can put a price on somebody's head. And so killing for money has become an incentive for some of these gangs who have guns anyway, and who are out there warring amongst themselves. Well, I can pick up $10,000 if I can target this person or that person. So have you seen that, Joe?
Yeah, it's becoming more and more with the social media. They're putting it, well, actually it was happening in the TTG case, and then it started to, I guess it grew in that area where the contract murders for the drug organization. So then that started another organization where it was just hitmen finding who had the contract out and then moving around the city. So you see groups of guys from East Baltimore going to West Baltimore, and then you'd start to build murder evidence and see why they were doing it. It was because they were being funded by other drug organizations.
Yeah, when we call them gangs, it's, I think that's somewhat, people think of having a code and colors and things like that, but they're really crews, right? They're crews of people who know each other in a certain area that run together.
Yeah, these guys in life sentence grew up in the same neighborhood. In many cases were related to one another. So it isn't like, the Crips and the Bloods. Mm-hmm. It's the neighborhood group.
Hey, I'm Scott Shane. I have two questions. One is, I think just from his name, Montana Barronette, stuck in a lot of people's heads, and what he was charged with. I remember the police press conference where he was called Baltimore's #1 trigger puller, wasn't that it?
Yes.
Anyway, so one question that I had, haven't read the book yet, and you undoubtedly addressed this, but is he an extraordinary person, an aberrant person, an extreme personality, maybe some kind of, mental illness, or is he a normal guy? You kind of touched on this briefly. Is he a normal guy who was a product, as you said, of a very strange environment? That's my first question. Second question is about guns. The whole country is focused on guns. We usually pay attention in so-called mass shootings, but in a city like Baltimore, you see the equivalent every several days. I wrote about this stuff way back in the 90s, and my impression was that even then there were so many guns, that actually people were more focused on bullets. They had to get bullets, and that seemed like more of a choke point. I just wonder if your experience writing the book, or Joe's experience as a cop, sheds any light on, is anything that we're talking about in terms of gun safety legislation relevant at all to a city like Baltimore?
First of all, let me say this is Scott Shane, who's one of the most distinguished reporters that Baltimore has ever produced. He worked at The Sun for years, New York Times. He just retired from the New York Times, covered national security issues. So I'm flattered to see you here, Scott. And you're going to have to remind me what the first question was.
The first one was about whether Montana Barronette, this extreme number of killings, whether how it was his mental illness.
I get it now. Yeah. Well,
Just in a strange environment.
yeah. I think that this entire book makes the argument that he is not a strange guy. He's not a genius. He was a capable, ambitious, smart, somewhat poised, confident young man who grew up in an environment, as you read the book, you see, where it was perfectly natural for him to gravitate out to the corners. His mother taught him the trade. His older brother was involved in it. He gravitated in that direction. And interestingly, and I want to hear what Joe has to say about Montana too. Interestingly, while Montana is going in this direction and gradually becoming the neighborhood ringleader, he's also still going to high school. And he's living on the streets. He doesn't have, his grandmother is not waking him up in the morning and making him go to school. He has no role model that makes him go to school, but he went to school until he graduated. He was the first member of his family to walk across the stage and graduate. So that illustrates to me that there was something about him that distinguished him from the run of the mill in the neighborhood. But I think he became what he became because of the place where he grew up. And Joe, what did you think?
Yeah, he had so many opportunities to get out of it, but it was like that neighborhood, his brother, and his family was good. So he could have just like stayed, went to school and done whatever he wanted. He was so smart and was like, as investigators, like we couldn't wait to get out and interact with him because he was funny. And, you know, he like, it was a good time to deal with him. Like even in the trial, he would walk past and, you know, disregard the lawyers, like 20 all across the board, and we're good. He would still like make jokes, even though he was facing his life sentences coming up. But he was, I think even when he was, he went to jail, and it was when he was getting sentenced, he was still would smile in the courtroom. It was like nothing ever broke him down. And I don't know how he would be now, but he would like people on the street corner, as soon as he stepped out, they'd be running up to him. So it's definitely unique. And
We referenced it briefly, but one of the things that I found really remarkable and revealing about Montana was that he was locked up. This is after the press conference where he was called by the police commissioner, the #1 trigger puller in the city, right? He's in lockup awaiting trial, and they accidentally released him. He was facing life in prison, right? What would you do if they let you out of jail by accident and you were facing a trial where you would go to prison for the rest of your life? You would disappear as fast as you could disappear. You know what Montana did? He went back to his neighborhood. That was his world. You know, that was the only place he felt comfortable. I found that to be really startling. He's not stupid.
yeah, no, he was still nice even when he got found. He was like, man, like he wasn't like he was gonna put up a fight. I can't believe that. He like we interrupted him and his girlfriend, so he was like more upset about that, and then was just like getting ready to go into jail. So.
Yeah. And then you know, I don't know the gun question. You know, it's so horrible in this country. You know, I despair of anything that can be done, you know, to curb gun violence. I think one thing which I regard as just a basic fact is that the more guns there are, the more gun violence there will be. But I don't see any chance of reducing the number of guns on the streets, in people's homes. This idiot out in, where was he, Kansas, who shot that kid who came up to his front door. I mean, this has just become a horrible facet of American life. And I don't think it'll be solved in our lifetime, Scott.
If I could make it just a little bit lighter. You both have experience dealing with Hollywood. Do you have any advice or interesting stories about dealing with the left coast?
Oh, yeah. You want to go first, Justin?
I mean, it was a great experience. I don't know. I'm not sure what to say.
I often say, you know, Black Hawk Down, which was my great experience with the book being made into a film, was the most fun I could have without getting arrested. And, you know, there's absolutely no downside to being involved in a movie that's being made by Jerry Bruckheimer and Ridley Scott. From the beginning of mapping out how to adapt the book, to choosing a location, to being in Morocco, you know, with a cast of thousands, watching Ridley Scott, one of the great filmmakers of modern times, sitting there orchestrating this incredibly complicated process, and then out in Hollywood helping edit this into a film. And it was scary because I sat there with Ridley and Pietro Scalia, who won an Oscar for film editing for Black Hawk Down, and they would ask me what I thought they should do, you know, piecing together portions of the film. And so it was thrilling. It was tremendous fun, very satisfying. I can remember when the movie came out, we premiered it all over the world. So we were going initially to cities all over the United States, and then we went to Europe, everywhere on private planes. I've never been someone who travels frequently on private planes, but let me tell you, this is the perk of modern life. You show up at the airport, somebody gives you a drink, and they, have a seat, put your feet up. So Rome, Madrid, Paris, London. At a certain point, I told them I need to go home. I had work to do. I have a family at home. And they were like, why would you leave? Because they were going on to Warsaw and Moscow and Tokyo. They were going all around the world. And I stayed on that ride as long as I possibly could. But then I remember pulling my garbage cans up to the top of the driveway when I got home about a week later thinking, man, the carriage has turned back into a pumpkin.
I guess to answer your question, I think we were proud of, I was really proud about the number of local people who got to be involved in the show, who either got to act in it, even portray themselves, people who get to work on the crew and things like that. I knew that this was another story that was going to put Baltimore in a bad light. People to this day, The Wire's 20 years old and people still say The Wire is the reason people have a bad view of the city. It's not fair. But I think we were trying to portray something that did happen here, something that needed to be a necessary postscript to The Wire, and part of it that I think they didn't overlook police corruption, but now we were going to focus on that in hopes of sort of making sure that these things get their due. So, and that's an interesting. I wanted to bring up, this notion that Montana Barronette is a serial killer, or having killed 12 people. If he's a white guy in Kansas, that's all over the news, and I think that speaks to sort of who we value as victims. I mean, this was almost a blip locally.
Yeah. I write about it in the book about how, as a young reporter, I would tell my city editor, there were 4 people shot dead in West Philadelphia last night. Why aren't we writing about it? And he said, it's not news. It happens every night. These people are always killing each other, which tells you something. I mean, it's a racist outlook. It's just another reflection of, and I think, white indifference to that level of violence. Something like, 160,000 young black men have been murdered in the last, 15 years in this country. If that number was young white men, the whole country would be up in arms. We would be geared up to do something big about that problem. And we aren't. I think
my question goes right to that topic. And you have, and I'm too lazy to find the answer, so you have a broad knowledge of the world. Is this problem, this disparity, we live in 2 Baltimores. We all know we have 2 Baltimores and probably 2 Philadelphias, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But is this an American problem, this disparity, these 2 worlds that people live in, or is it a more global problem?
It's a global phenomenon. In this country, it's very stark between African Americans and Caucasians, because that's just the history of our country. These population groups came together here on this continent. But if you go to Iran, the Kurds are hated, in Iran. The people of the Baha'i faith are persecuted in Iran. If you go to Africa, if you go to most countries in Africa, there's such hostility between various tribal factions. And you see it all the time if you read what's going on right now in Sudan, or you read about what's going on in Kenya. These kinds of racist differences are not peculiar to the United States. What I will say is that I think, as poorly as we have done so far, this country has at least been grappling with this for a long time in a much more direct way than you find in places like Iran or India, where there's caste systems where people are untouchables. And this is, people everywhere divide themselves into the privileged and the underprivileged, the good and the bad. Yes, sir.
Religious differences, Protestants and Catholics.
Yep.
Jews and Muslims.
People in Orthodox Jews and more modern secular Jews in Israel right now, big hostilities. People can find so many ways and reasons to hate one another. Jonathan Swift's famous analogy was the great dispute between the 2 groups of people, one who preferred to break their eggs on the rounded side, and the other who preferred to break their eggs on the pointed side. People find any excuse at all to think that they're better than somebody else. And that translates into huge societal problems and hatreds.
Two more questions. Right here.
Just a quick question. In your research, why do you feel as though Barronette was not retaliated against? You talk a lot about the retaliatory violence. Just kind of want to get your input on that. And then during your research, what is some of the most shocking things that you learned about Montana or his crew? Something that you never would have thought would have happened in the streets of America, like in Baltimore.
Well, the answer to your first question is that there were efforts to retaliate against Montana. He was shot at one point, which I write about in the book. And then after he was arrested, his younger sister was murdered. She was not involved in any way in what her brothers were doing. She was, working as a nurse's aide. She had like 3 jobs. Somebody called, invited her to come out and do their nails because she had sort of a side business doing nails and makeup. So she drove out to a job and she was murdered. And she was murdered by somebody, almost certainly, who's either had a family member or a friend who was killed by, or they believe he was killed by Montana Barronette. When I talked about this earlier about revenge killings.
That actually makes me think of something. There's a major case that was brought just months ago that involves a lot of players in this book and in this story that's going to play out, involving a massive amount of violence. I think you had sort of foreshadowed that there was going to be. You said the murder charges were pending. Well, they dropped a few months ago, so there's going to be a lot more on this story to come.
Yeah, I think you asked what I found. I don't know. I think you asked what was the most shocking. I found what they were doing to be incredibly shocking. What was really surprising to me was they were making very sophisticated videos, rap videos, where they would act out scenarios from murders that they had been involved with. And these were not like home movies. You can find them online. Do a Google search for TTG, on YouTube, and you'll find, I think there are like 10 of them, in color, shot with drones, very sophisticated editing.
One's My City, right?
One's called My City, yeah. And it actually hurt them because, when they were being prosecuted under the RICO statute, the prosecutors had to show that all of the members of the gang worked together. And so the fact that they were making these videos, you could see, them in reenacting, their crimes. And some of what they were doing on an artistic level rebounded to hurt them at trial.
I'm interested in your perspective on the spike in murders after Freddie Gray, and which haven't really come down. Is there a short answer to that?
I think Joe can probably speak to it more directly than me. My hunch is that a lot of city police stopped patrolling and working in neighborhoods that were difficult, or where they felt they were not wanted, or where they had been insulted, or where protesters had called them names or whatever. That's an impression I had. Joe knows better.
I think your hunch was the reality. Exactly what it was, that the police, they weren't really patrolling as they were. And then the arrest, because along with the violence going up, if you look, the arrest numbers went down. And then I think now mainly it's just that the violence will go down with the investigative efforts where they get support from like the federal teams, ATF, FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, because it's tough to go out and put a case together from just the Baltimore Police Department. You need these outside resources who can support the case and give you the surveillance equipment to listen to these individuals and gather all the evidence, because with that increase in crime, it's just a decrease in the local police activity. And that's why it's going to keep going up until it looks like the strike force program, they're building off of that. So a lot of things get in place, but it's going to take some time before it catches up and starts to decrease again.
But isn't the inverse also true, where there's a lot of these RICO cases will cite, a gun arrest that was made by a city officer that was perhaps incidental, but once they start pulling everything together, that becomes part of the case. Evidence.
So you gather all the evidence, make them see what's available to you. So each individual suspect, you'll go through their background, what's their past, what's still pending, what's still good evidence to bring into this. And in each murder investigation, You're going to look at the witnesses available. When those witnesses are brought in, now you have this broad range of murders. So you're going to talk to that witness about all the murders and then see what you can gather from that. So it's kind of like you're dissecting them, and then when witnesses they're talking, then you're doing a statement analysis. All right, well, they said this, and then that's going to lead to that. So it grows, but it grows with support from, not the Baltimore Police's detective can't bring down, you need other agencies to come in.
Yeah, I think that the whole Freddie Gray episode was, among many other things, a deeply disheartening experience for police, because at the center of it was police were arrested and charged with murder. And so, I think if you are working in a neighborhood where you feel like you're putting your life at risk all the time, and then, your partner gets prosecuted by the district attorney, fair or unfair, it gives you the feeling like the city does not have our backs. Why should we be going out and doing aggressive policing when we could find ourselves in court being prosecuted for crimes?
But then it wasn't, it was also a decrease in staffing comes into play. So, and that's just across the board, not just Baltimore Police Department. So.
Yeah.
For the time we have tonight, I want to thank Justin, Mark, and Joe again.
Thanks for coming. Come on back. I'd like to
Before we say goodbye, Mark's going to sign some books. I'm going to bring everybody back in the green room, and then they're going to come out. My colleague Sophia, right here, will be the front of the line. If everyone could buy a book, get in line, get your book signed. We'll see you in about 5 minutes.
Give this to your dad. I will. All right, thank you.
Get your grandfather.
You want to get a quick picture for you going to see you, please? Sure. I want to get you to the dad. My dad was just telling me where you were. Boy, you lady said, just like your promo shot. Okay, one more time, sir. Smile. That's my way of saying I read your book, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You didn't forget where you came from.
Well, that was fun.
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's so good to really do something about food. Oh, yeah. Oh, no.
Well, that's notorious.
So you're related to the
What is
dentist.
your,
I remember, I have a question.
Is this thing on? Is this thing on? No. I have a question. I see they've left, but.
How are you? Thanks for coming. His kids were all not twins though. Oh yeah, how's that? You know, people that think is that. That's my wife. Nice to meet you, Brian. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.